Is she still asleep? That was the first thing I heard when I picked up our kitchen phone last Tuesday morning. A man's voice, low, casual, like we were in on the same secret. Only, I had no idea who he was. For a second, I just stood there, gripping the receiver. The call had come through on our landline, a dusty relic we keep for emergencies, so I knew it wasn't some telemarketer. "I'm sorry, who is this?" I asked. There was a pause. Then the line went dead. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Marlene was upstairs, supposedly sleeping in after a restless night. I didn't move. My mind started chewing on questions it had no business chewing on. Why would someone call here at this hour and ask that? And why did it sound like they expected me not to answer? I thought about waking her, asking outright. But something in me, some gnawing, suspicious part, decided to wait. Instead, I checked the caller ID. Nothing. Just private number. The rest of the day felt wrong. She came downstairs an hour later in the same robe she'd worn to bed, hair a little messy, smiling faintly like she'd just had the best sleep in years. I made coffee. She kissed my cheek. I didn't mention the call. Not yet. But here's the thing. At 3:12 p.m., the phone rang again. Same private number. I let it go to the answering machine. The voice was the same man. Only this time, he didn't sound casual. He sounded impatient. "We need to talk. Tonight. Usual place." Then the click. I don't know what usual place means. I don't know how many times they've talked before. But I do know one thing. If I play this wrong, I might never find out the truth. And I can't live with that. The moment that message hit the answering machine, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. "We need to talk. Tonight. Usual place." It was so deliberate, like the voice belonged to someone who had no doubt she'd understand exactly what he meant. And that bothered me more than anything. I know my wife's habits better than I know my own. But this was outside of every habit I've ever seen. I tried to go about the afternoon as if nothing was gnawing at me, but every small thing she did felt like a clue I was supposed to interpret. When she folded the laundry, did she seem distracted? When she checked her phone by the window, was she hiding the screen from me? I caught myself staring at her too much, and she caught me staring back once. She smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile I remembered. It was quick, polite, almost like it was designed to end the moment before it started. By 6 p.m., I'd already decided I wasn't going to confront her directly. Not yet. If I wanted the truth, I needed to see it without her having the chance to dress it up in explanations. She said she was going to run to the store for a few things for dinner. That's when I made my move. I waited a minute after she pulled out of the driveway, then grabbed my keys and followed. I kept my distance, just enough to stay invisible in the evening traffic. She didn't head to the grocery store. Instead, she took a road we never use, one that leads toward the old part of town, where the streets narrow and the buildings lean in like they're sharing secrets. My heart was pounding, not from the speed, but from the way the picture in my head was starting to form. She pulled into a small, dimly lit parking lot behind a cafe I didn't even realize was still open. From my car, I saw her step out and glance around. Not hurried, not nervous, just scanning the lot. Then a man walked out from the shadows on the side of the building. He wasn't young, but he had a kind of self-assurance that filled the space between them. And when he smiled at her, she smiled back, longer, softer, like she'd been waiting for it all day. I couldn't hear a word they said, but I could see her hand touch his arm, and I could see his hand brush hers as if it was second nature. They walked inside together. No hesitation, no looking back. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, wondering how far I was willing to go to find out who he was, and just how much of my life had already been rewritten without me knowing. I told myself I was just going to sit there, watch, and leave. That I didn't need to know every detail, only enough to confirm what my gut had been screaming since that first phone call. But the problem with curiosity is that it doesn't stop at the edges. It pushes, claws, and drags you deeper until you've crossed lines you never thought you would. That's exactly what happened to me sitting in that car. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The cafe's front windows glowed faintly, but the glare from the street lamps made it impossible to see more than vague shapes moving inside. I hated it. I hated that I could only see the outline of her hand gesturing as she spoke, the tilt of her head toward him, the occasional lean forward that made their faces nearly touch. Every little movement was a knife in my stomach. Eventually, I couldn't stand the guessing. I stepped out of my car and walked toward the side of the building, sticking to the darker patches where the light didn't reach. The closer I got, the clearer their voices became. Not clear enough to hear every word, but enough to catch fragments. Her laugh was there, but not the polite chuckle she gave me when I made one of my tired old jokes. This laugh was alive, almost like the version of her I'd met decades ago. He said something about last time and next week, and she nodded without hesitation. There was a narrow side window, half obscured by an old Live Music Thursdays poster. I leaned just enough to see inside. They weren't sitting across from each other like strangers catching up. They were side by side in a booth, shoulders touching. He had a hand resting casually on the table, and hers was right there, close enough that their fingers could link with the smallest movement. I don't know how long I stood there, my breath fogging the glass, my heart hammering loud enough I was sure someone could hear. I kept waiting for something, some innocent explanation, some sign that this was all in my head. Instead, I saw her reach into her bag, pull out a folded piece of paper, and slide it across to him. He read it, smirked, and tucked it into his jacket. That was the moment something inside me shifted. This wasn't a harmless catch-up. This wasn't just coffee. There was history here, and plans for the future, plans I wasn't supposed to be part of. I backed away from the window before I did something stupid, but I knew I wasn't leaving. Not yet. If they were meeting next week, I was going to make sure I found out exactly where and why, even if it meant following her further into whatever this was. I waited in my car with the engine off, headlights dark, watching the cafe door like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. The minutes crawled, each one stretching my nerves tighter. Finally, the door swung open and they stepped out together. The way they moved, it was subtle, but telling. They didn't walk side by side like acquaintances heading in the same direction. They walked like people who had a rhythm, who'd done this enough times to know exactly where the other would step. He glanced over his shoulder once, scanning the lot, and I instinctively slid lower in my seat. Marlene didn't look around at all. She just smiled faintly, like she was carrying a private joke in her head. They didn't head toward her car. Instead, they crossed the lot to his. It was an older black sedan, the kind you don't notice unless you're looking for it. I half expected her to drive away separately, but no, she opened the passenger door and slipped in like it was the most natural thing in the world. That small, simple motion was enough to drain the air from my lungs. In 37 years, I had never seen her get into another man's car without me there. I started the engine the moment his taillights flared. Keeping my distance was tricky on those narrow streets, but he didn't seem to notice. They drove out of the old town and into the quieter edges of the city where street lamps were fewer and houses sat far apart. My hands were sweating so badly I had to wipe them on my jeans. I kept asking myself what I'd do if they pulled over somewhere. Would I confront them? Take pictures? Or just sit there like a coward, trying to convince myself it wasn't what it looked like? About 20 minutes later, the sedan slowed and turned onto a gravel driveway I didn't recognize. There was a small cabin at the end, half hidden by trees, with a faint light glowing in one of the windows. He parked close to the door, and they both got out. Marlene paused to say something. Her hand touched his arm, and then they disappeared inside. The door shut, and the light inside flickered like a lamp being adjusted. I stayed there in my car, far enough back that I could barely see the cabin through the branches. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like my ribs might crack. Every instinct told me to get out, to demand an explanation, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I stared at that faint glow in the window and wondered how many times this scene had played out before tonight, and how many truths she'd buried under the life we built together. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even try. I drove home eventually, but my mind was still parked in front of that cabin, replaying every second of what I'd seen. I wanted answers, but I knew storming in there would only get me lies or half-truths, and I needed something solid, something she couldn't twist into another version of reality. By morning, I had a plan, though calling it a plan makes it sound more thought out than it really was. Truth be told, it was desperation in a cheap disguise. The first step was figuring out who he was. That old black sedan wasn't anything special, but I remembered the license plate. I didn't write it down. I didn't have to. It was burned into my brain. I made a few discreet inquiries, called an old buddy who works in vehicle records. He owed me a favor from years back, and after some grumbling, he gave me the name tied to that plate, Colin Mercer. It didn't ring a bell. I searched the name online, expecting some bland result, maybe a contractor or a salesman. But what I found instead made my stomach tighten. Pictures of him from community events, charity fundraisers, all with that same confident smile. And there, in one of the older photos, was Marlene. Not beside him, but close enough in the background that it didn't feel accidental. I started noticing small connections I'd never paid attention to before. That gala she'd gone to last spring with a friend? He was on the guest list. That week she claimed she was visiting her cousin 2 towns over. Colin's business had hosted a networking retreat at a lakeside lodge, probably the same cabin I'd seen. I kept scrolling through his life, piecing together moments where her story and his location lined up almost too perfectly. It wasn't just chance. It was a pattern, and I'd been blind to it. For the rest of the day, I walked around the house in a fog, my thoughts circling the same question. How far had this gone? Was it new? Was it old? Had our marriage been coexisting with something else for years, something I was too comfortable or too cowardly to see? Every time she spoke to me that evening, I caught myself studying her face, wondering if I could spot the difference between the woman I thought I knew and the woman who got into his car without hesitation. That night, as she slept, I stood at the bedroom window staring into the dark, rehearsing how I might ask her without sounding like I was begging for the truth. Because that's the part that scared me the most. Not that she might lie, but that I might still want to believe her, even if I already knew the answer. By the next morning, I realized I couldn't keep circling around this thing forever. Watching from a distance was eating me alive, and every day I waited gave her more time to cover her tracks. But I also knew marching up to her and demanding answers would just make her retreat deeper into whatever story she's been crafting. I needed her to speak without realizing she was confessing, and to do that, I'd have to create the right situation. I told her I had to drive out of town for a work-related errand, something tedious that would keep me away until late. I even threw in a comment about how she'd probably enjoy having the house to herself for a while. She gave me that small, polite smile again, the one I've grown to hate in the past week. I left the driveway like I was heading for the highway, but as soon as I was out of sight, I looped back through a side street and parked my car 2 blocks away. From there, I walked home, sticking to the alleys and tree lines until I had a clear view of our front porch from behind a neighbor's hedge. It felt ridiculous, standing there like some amateur spy, but I told myself this was the only way to know. For over an hour, nothing happened. She moved around the kitchen, maybe tidying up, maybe making tea. I started to wonder if I'd overplayed my hand, if she was just going to spend the evening reading on the couch. Then, right on cue, a familiar black sedan rolled slowly into the street. My pulse kicked hard against my ribs. Colin didn't park in front of the house. He stopped at the corner, engine idling, and within seconds, Marlene stepped out the front door wearing a coat I hadn't seen in years, a deep green one she used to wear on special occasions. She walked quickly, like she'd done this before, and slipped into the passenger seat without looking back. The sedan glided away, just like the night at the cafe, only now I was close enough to feel the betrayal in real time. I didn't follow them this time. Instead, I went inside and headed straight for the place I knew she kept her personal things, an old wooden box in the back of the closet. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside, I found a folded note that stopped me cold. Next Thursday, same time, same place. Bring the scarf. You know why? No signature, no date, but the handwriting was hers, and the paper looked worn, like it had been handled more than once. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, and sat in the dark living room waiting for her to return, rehearsing what I would say. But as the hours dragged on, I realized something important. I wasn't sure if I wanted her to come back at all. It was well past midnight when I finally heard the crunch of tires on the driveway. I'd been sitting in the dark for hours, the only sound in the room the slow ticking of the mantel clock. Every creak of the house had me glancing toward the door, and by the time her headlights cut across the living room walls, my stomach was knotted so tight I could barely breathe. The front door opened slowly, like she was trying not to wake me. She stepped inside, closed it gently, and hung her coat on the hook. I stayed still, letting the shadows hide me, watching her hesitate in the hallway as if she could sense something was off. "Marlene," I said finally, my voice low but sharp enough to make her flinch. She turned toward me, her eyes adjusting to the darkness, and for a moment she just stared. "You're home late," I added, forcing the words out evenly even though my chest was hammering. She gave me the same tired excuse she'd used before. Traffic, lost track of time. But her tone was too smooth, too rehearsed. I told her I knew where she'd been. I told her about Colin Mercer, about the cafe, about the cabin, about the note in her box. I expected her to deny it, to get defensive, to accuse me of snooping. But instead, she let out this small, almost pitying sigh and sat down across from me, leaning forward like she was about to deliver bad news to a child. "You don't understand, Emmett," she said quietly. "It's not what you think." Those words have a way of making you believe you're about to hear something redeemable, something that will take the knife out of your back. But then she kept talking, and the knife only twisted deeper. She said she'd known Colin for years, before me, even. She said he'd been part of her life in ways I could never imagine, and that their meetings were about something important that she couldn't explain yet. The worst part? She didn't look guilty. She looked resolute, like she'd already accepted that I might hate her for the truth, but was willing to live with it. I pressed her for details, but every answer was a half answer, every explanation more vague than the last. She said it wasn't an affair in the way I thought, but she also wouldn't tell me what it actually was. She claimed she'd been protecting me from complications I wasn't ready to handle. I asked her point blank if she loved him. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She just stared at me with a kind of sadness that felt worse than any confession. By the time she went upstairs, I was left sitting there in the dark again. Except now I had even less than before. No clear truth, no closure, just the certainty that she was hiding something bigger than I'd imagined. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I wanted to know what it was, because whatever it was, it had clearly been there long before I ever became part of her story. I didn't sleep that night either. Her words kept looping in my head. "It's not what you think, protecting you from complications." I kept going over every moment of the past few weeks, every strange smile, every quiet phone call, every step she'd taken away from me. By dawn, I had decided I couldn't live in that limbo anymore. If she wasn't going to tell me the truth willingly, I'd have to dig until I found it myself. But fate beat me to it. Around mid-morning, I heard her car pull into the driveway much earlier than usual. She came inside holding a manila folder and wearing that deep green coat again. This time, though, she didn't avoid my eyes. She walked straight into the living room, set the folder on the coffee table, and sat across from me. "You've been tearing yourself apart over this," she said softly. "I should have told you sooner. I thought I was protecting you, but I see now I was just shutting you out." She pushed the folder toward me. Inside were papers, photographs, and letters, dozens of them. At first glance, they looked like a jumble of old documents, but the dates caught my attention. They went back decades, long before we were married. As I flipped through them, I started piecing together the story. Colin wasn't her secret lover. He was her half-brother. They'd been separated when they were young because of a messy family situation she'd never wanted to drag into our marriage, an inheritance dispute that had torn her relatives apart. For years, she'd believed he wanted nothing to do with her. Then, a few months ago, he'd reached out. He was dealing with the final stages of a complicated estate settlement, and it turned out Marlene was legally tied to it. All those meetings, the cabin, the cryptic notes, they were about sorting through their late father's old property and personal effects before the lawyers finalized everything. The scarf? It was something of their mother's, needed to prove a personal claim to a family heirloom. The secrecy, she admitted, was because she knew how suspicious it would all look from the outside, especially given how much time she was spending with him. And maybe, she confessed, a small part of her had feared I'd resent her for having a whole part of her life I'd never been part of. By the time she finished explaining, the tight knot in my chest had loosened into something else entirely. Relief mixed with a heavy dose of embarrassment. All those late nights I'd spent imagining the worst. All the shadows I'd turned into monsters. And here she was, showing me that the truth wasn't betrayal, but family. We spent the rest of the day going through the papers together. Some of it was complicated legal jargon I barely understood, but in between, she told me stories about her childhood, about Colin, about the little pieces of her life she'd locked away. And for the first time in weeks, she laughed the way she used to, with no edge, no distance, just warmth. That night, as we sat together in the quiet, I realized something important. Trust isn't about never having doubts. It's about what you do when those doubts start to eat at you. I'd gone about it the wrong way, sure, but somehow, in the mess of suspicion and silence, we'd found a way back to each other. And maybe, just maybe, the next 37 years could be even better than the first.